I got involved in education research, the field was actually in disrepute. At the time, a distinguished historian of education said that education research had an awful reputation, both among academics and among people in the outside world. And it wasn't that research hadn't been done. The problem was that it didn't seem to add up to anything. It seemed that there were studies that said one thing and other studies said a different thing, and it was incoherent. There was not an easy way to understand what had been learned.
So before Larry, when people were, first approaching, there's a lot of studies, how do I make sense of them? They would sort of say, well, I could average them. I don't know, I'll just take these results from these studies and I'll just put them all together in some way. And that's not very objective, right? Larry standardized it. He said, okay, so what are the features? We need to have a common metric that we use across all studies.
Meta-analysis is a systematic way of finding coherence in the chaos, if you will.
Meta-analysis is the combination of many different results into one study. So it's saying, let's look across not one particular study in one place, but let's look across a wide range of studies on the same topic and look to see overall of those what we find.
The point is, picking one or two studies that happen to agree with your prejudices and extolling their virtues as the evidence on which to base policy is not only unscientific, it's not very intellectual.
Sometimes we talk about you can't see the forest because you're just concentrating on the trees. That's what Larry helps us do, is that the individual researchers, we're looking at this tree or that tree. And what Larry's work does is say, okay, now we can take a step back, let's look at the whole forest.
You can imagine an example in which the same thing has been studied 10 times, and in 2 of the studies, the intervention seems to work. But in 8 of the studies, it seems not to work very well, when in fact the intervention works in all of the studies, but only rises to the level of statistical significance in 2 of them. And this isn't just a fanciful example. In 1959, there was a first clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial, of a particular intervention in medicine. By 1974, there had been a total of 10 studies that looked at this intervention. By 1988, there had been 34 studies of this intervention, and 5 of them showed that the treatment worked, but 29 of them showed that it didn't. Again, this sounds not very promising. But when I tell you what the intervention is, you'll probably recognize it. It's so-called thrombolytic therapy, clot-busting drugs for people who get heart attacks. And by 1988, it was made the standard of care for heart attacks. And today, if you have a heart attack, this is the first thing they'll do to you when they get to the hospital. And in the 15 years between 1974, when we could have known, in fact, a meta-analysis would have shown that the treatment was effective and had reduced the death rate by about 20%. In that 15-year period, 1.5 million people in the US alone died unnecessarily because we didn't have the appropriate tools. This same kind of thing obviously can happen in education.
For example, there's a study that was conducted in the 80s called the Tennessee class size experiment, and they randomized students to small class sizes or regular class sizes, or another condition which was regular class size, but you had an additional teacher in the room, an aide. And so you would think going into that regular class size with 2 teachers may actually be really good. And an interesting finding there was that the small class size did show large impacts, but the regular class with an extra person in it didn't help at all.
Perhaps I can give you an example that might be useful. There are quite a few studies in the mid-1980s that had been done that tried to relate the inputs to schooling, like money, and the outputs of schooling, like academic achievement. The economists were completely convinced that the evidence showed definitively that resources were unrelated to the outcomes of schooling. And this, of course, was a very popular conclusion in key part of the defense for not creating more equitable financing of schools. I became convinced, actually because of a student who took a class of mine, that this was a classic case of a mistaken way of combining research results. And we decided that we'd have a look to see whether or not the results, if they were analyzed properly, would suggest the same conclusion. The point was that the very evidence that people had been pointing to for 20 years to say that resources were unrelated to outcomes of schooling were, in fact, if anything, pointing in the opposite direction.
So I think at the beginning of his career, Larry was swimming against the current.
As you're starting out as a young scholar, if you're doing something that's sort of different than what people have done before, you can be a little afraid that you're taking a risk and that you may not get tenure or it may not work out. And people did not think it was a legitimate area of study, and it was not something that the statistics community embraced.
He likes to dispel, I might say, myths that exist in his work life. He loves to be his own work taskmaster and drive things forward in his own particular way. His big way of thinking about things influences us all, because if someone comes to him in our family with a particular problem, his incisive way immediately goes to the heart of the problem and, well, what about A, B, C, and D?
So today, he's not swimming against the current at all anymore. Today, the impact of his ideas has just fundamentally reshaped education. Larry's fundamental contribution in this field, especially around meta-analysis, has fundamentally transformed how we understand data, especially noisy data. And that's just going to become more and more important as we are bombarded with more and more data over the years.
I think that meta-analysis is just beginning, honestly. Because I think we're in a world in which there's data and more data and more data, and we're going to see more studies and more experiments. We already have a long history of studies, and it's just exploding over time. And so you have to continually make sense of lots and lots of data, and how do you deal with these contradictory findings?
I grew up in a family of very modest means in California. It was Central California, an agricultural region of brutally hot summers and miserably cold winters. My father had never graduated from high school. He worked for the minimum wage all his life. My mother worked at the local college, but she worked in the cafeteria washing pots and pans. And when I was a child, we didn't know anybody who went to college. People used the phrase college kids to refer to some alien species that was inhabited a different world than ours. The reason that I had the life that I did was because of education. It's actually why I went into education as a field of study, because I wanted others to have that opportunity too. It's very important to remember that in education, a failure to provide the best education we can for a child is something that affects them for the rest of their lives. I'm going to use whatever I gain from this prize to try and increase the profile of evidence in education for the purposes of improving education. Evidence and even science are under attack these days, not just in the US, but worldwide, or at least in other parts of the world too. And I think in a situation like this, it's important that we avoid any mistakes that can be used to discredit education, to discredit evidence and education science, because there are people who would prefer to make policy decisions on the basis of preferences and superstitions and prejudices and politics, rather than on the basis of evidence about what's good for the country or the world.